know it's coming towards the end of the day, but we still have a fabulous fireside chat today with Julia Reinaud. I'm thrilled to have her on the stage with me today. Julia has been working in the field of climate and energy for the past 2 decades and joined Breakthrough Energy in 2018. Founded by Bill Gates at the Paris Climate Change Conference in 2015, Breakthrough Energy aims to accelerate innovation and support new technologies that will help pave the way towards net zero. Julia has been at the forefront of implementing the organization's activities and partnerships in Europe, working with the European Commission and the European Investment Bank to set up Breakthrough Energy Ventures Europe, a €100 million fund dedicated to investing in Europe's best clean energy entrepreneurs. So, in this session, we'll be discussing the breakthrough we need to tackle climate change and the role startups, scale-ups, and VCs can play within that innovation, as well as Julia's experiences and learnings from Breakthrough Energy. So welcome to the stage, Julia. Thank you. I'm going to take these 2 seats in the middle. So, Julia, thanks so much for coming to the stage with me today. I think we've got a real mixed discipline audience here today. So I think it would be great to start with a little bit about Breakthrough Energy before we dive into you.
Of course.
So, yeah, I suppose it'd be great to know, what does Breakthrough Energy do, and how do you fit within that? What's your role within their mission?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's the closing of the conference, but I've certainly been very impressed by who I've been able to meet and what I've seen. There's one slide that I thought would always be helpful to understand what we do at Breakthrough. So indeed, we were launched by our founder, Bill Gates, in 2015 at the Paris COP, all with the idea that we need to accelerate, first develop and then deploy and accelerate the transition to net zero by scaling and developing the technologies that we need to reach net zero. But of course, in that journey, what's important is really to tailor and to cater to where the different technologies are, where the research is, where the companies are, and where the landscape is when it comes to their journey in terms of reaching net zero. So we focus on what we call the 5 grand challenges. So all of the sectors that emit CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, so agriculture, buildings, manufacturing, transportation, and the energy sector. And we have a number of programs. And the way we think at Breakthrough is technology, capital, policy, and partnerships. So if you can see the slide up there, at the earliest stages, we're really tailored to what do researchers need, what do first-time entrepreneurs need, and that's in the form of grant funding, right? But it's not just about grant funding against specific technology milestones. It's also much of what we heard today is we need that type of mentoring, as well as what we call business fellows. So we have innovation fellows, and then we support them with business fellows who help them think through their strategy, the partnerships, linking up to corporates, linking up to labs, and the like. So that's what we would call the first valley of death, and addressing that at that particular stage. When you're in research, but you still need to reach certain technology milestones. Then we provide capital in the form of helping capitalize companies, and that's the Breakthrough Energy Ventures Fund. And they've raised 3 funds. So we're talking, first fund was over $1 billion, the second same, and the third is still in the process of being funded. And out of here, we've supported around 120 plus companies that are all, again, developing leading breakthroughs, and Breakthrough Energy Ventures invests mostly in seed Series A. And so that's really trying to address the first capitalization needs. And associated with that, there's a BEV Select Fund that's more tailored to the growth funding stage of those companies as they're raising their Series B and beyond. And then last but not least, so that's the second sort of valley of death, much of what we heard of. But the third really is tailored towards, once you have a pilot, you need to really have a first scale demonstration or a first commercial scale. And this is what we call the Catalyst program, which is essentially project financing for first demo scales and first of a kind commercialization of projects. So we're talking about 100 million plus type of projects. And here we operate in providing both grant funding, equity, and we have a partnership that I'm sure we can talk about with the European institutions. And then, of course, so these are sort of the technology journey where we focus on the technologies that have the most impact. And by impact, we measure that at 0.5 gigaton of CO2 at scale. So those technologies really need to be impacting, which doesn't mean that the other technologies don't matter, but this is sort of where our bread and our DNA is. But once you think about technology and you think about capital, we need the right policies, you need the right markets, you need the right regulations, and you need the right partnerships. So this is perhaps at the bottom where I operate, which is more in the how do we engage with the policymakers, how do we help make the voices heard of the innovators, of the entrepreneurs, of the challenges that they're meeting because of regulation, but also how do we help them with some of the partnerships with corporates and with many other players in the field. So as you can see here, it's a breadth of entities, and where a network of, our network is huge of partners, and then within the organization we're over 100.
Wow, okay, so it's a huge network that does a lot of work at very different levels. Thanks for that intro, fabulous, to set us up. I think, rewinding a little bit, it would be amazing to know about your journey, because, you've had a really impressive, career, working in policy, climate philanthropy. What led you here, and where did that journey on the climate path start?
Sure. So I started, when I was just out of university, and we're talking about the early 2000s, when I remember having a professor talking to me about something called the Kyoto Protocol and a carbon market. And so the idea of how will a carbon market impact different companies, impact the environment sort of in which we're living in. So I was fortunate enough to join the International Energy Agency, where for about 6 years I advised governments on how to design good climate policies in a way that doesn't push those who are more proactive in having a carbon price leak to other countries. So this whole notion of carbon leakage. And then I joined the climate philanthropy space. So there are a lot of high net worth individuals as well as corporates who decide to engage more from a philanthropic perspective. So that means giving money in order to be impactful. And so I spent 5 years building up an organization that was essentially working in China and India, the US, and trying to advise on how do we decarbonize the heavy manufacturing sector, so steel, cement, chemicals. And I spent a lot of time working on that, technical assistance. And then I joined the European Climate Foundation, which was then an organization that was very focused on Europe. How do we move the needle to making sure that there's actual climate leadership in Europe? And that was more philanthropic from an advocacy standpoint. How do you support think tanks, organizations that have a mission in terms of solving the climate change problem, but also addressing it from a perspective of, how does good public policy, what is good public policy? And then I had the fortunate story of sort of meeting the Bill Gates team at the time. It was still housed in his private office, where he was starting to work much more on climate mitigation. And then that's how my story at Breakthrough started, always based out of Europe and really focusing on how do we make Europe a leader in this climate journey and support everything that goes with what is necessary to get to the change we need.
Yeah, amazing. I suppose, Breakthrough Energy was founded by Bill Gates, and you've been involved in the last 3 years with Breakthrough Energy. So what's been the most exciting development that you've witnessed?
Sure.
I want to start with the highs, and can you talk a little bit about your involvement in that development?
Sure. So I actually joined 6 years ago, so
6
my
years
journey
ago.
goes a bit
It's
further
longer than
away.
that,
But
yes.
one of the exciting things is we talk a lot about partnerships, but I also see a lot of value in part of those partnerships, as we're thinking about, is how does the private sector work better with the public sector? And you mentioned in my intro, Breakthrough Energy Ventures Europe, and also Breakthrough Energy, the Catalyst program that we have. We've been able to work with the European Commission and the European Investment Bank in terms of game-changing public-private partnerships, in terms of how do you make smart use of public capital in a way that attracts more private investment into this space. So those two endeavors certainly are showing, at least from where I stand, how governments are committed to the change, but how also you need to really sort of be patient with crafting the types of public-private partnerships that we need. Another excitement has been, so many of you here today are into this space, but I'd say that your bread and butter is much more around investing or is about growing your companies. And what we've been really thinking about is also how do we make your voices heard in the public policy space. And so a few years back, I remember speaking with a politician at the European level who said, the big challenge I have in making good public policy, and one that is more ambitious, is I know who to speak to as a company that's going to tell me it's really hard to transition and it's going to cost me a lot of money. But I'm missing the innovator, I'm missing the investor, I'm missing the banks who are telling me that it's actually possible to do. So about 2.5 years back, we created something called Clean Tech for Europe, where we started with essentially bringing together a number of venture funds who wanted to be vocal about the transition, who cared about their portfolio companies, but who also wanted to make sure that there's good public policy. Fast forward to where we are today, it's about 30 VCs. We also then created a group for scale-up companies, so companies that have raised 50 million euros or more, of the likes of Northvolt, Skeleton from the region. And essentially what we're building out is a public sort of policy voice of all of the community here. So again, where we are today, it started with Clean Tech for Europe, but we've got Clean Tech for Iberia that we launched in November at the Web Summit, Clean Tech for France, Tech for Net Zero in Germany, we've got Clean Tech for Nordics, and the list goes on. The idea being that it's really important to get these voices heard, because honestly, there are so many bottlenecks in the transition as you're scaling. Sometimes it's bad public policy, sometimes it's public policy that's too slow. And so these are the types of challenges that we want to bring forward to the policymakers in order to be able to help, address some of the challenges and create the markets that we need.
Okay, yeah, so the Clean Tech for Nordics, that launched quite recently. And what's your read on, I guess, kind of low carbon tech in the Nordics, since we're in Gothenburg now?
Yeah. Well, I got to learn more about the Nordics working with the wonderful team at Clean Tech Scandinavia who are running the initiative. First, I must say it's extraordinary if you compare the Nordic countries to other countries in Europe. It's not only the biggest clean energy supply that you have, particularly Norway or particularly Sweden, but also other countries with their geothermal technologies and capacities. The second thing is it's also a country that's electrified a lot, and where we sort of standpoint in our sort of thesis is you need to first electrify because that's probably going to be the cheapest option, and if you can't, you need to think about green molecules, and if you can't do that, you need to think about how you manage your carbon. So the Nordics for us were sort of a fantastic case example of if you look at Norway, it is an oil and gas country, but then it's also transitioned into being one of the leaders in CCS, in low carbon fuels, in low carbon technologies. But then in Sweden, again, they're fantastic case examples. I'm sure many have been speaking about the Northvolt or H2 Green Steel. So there's both sort of a very vibrant ecosystem of investors as well as innovators. And this is just a case example here of coming here. I feel so privileged also of this connection that we have with universities and how you're building up a full ecosystem. That said, what Clean Tech for Nordics did when it launched was to sort of take a state look of where are the Nordics now, who's performing well in terms of countries. Turns out that Sweden's perhaps performing better in terms of deals and fundraising. But then what are some of the challenges in order to be able to scale that up even further? And it started, of course, with what's so important and people have been talking about is the skills. Still needing to build up a lot of the skills around that, around the ecosystems and the companies that we have. But equally around, there's a number of sort of early stage ventures, but still what is lacking is once you're in that sort of journey, you've raised your seed funding, your Series A, how do you grow? And it's thinking about these issues of how do you attract more of the pension funds, more of the insurance and sort of infrastructure into this space, and what is the role of public policy in that? So second was really around sort of growth funding, where it's not specific to the Nordics, but certainly there's a lot of ambition to think about how we can address that. And then the third element was each country has its own specificity and own leadership, but certainly from the collective of the Clean Tech for Nordics was much more around how do we build up that regional voice and regional sort of expertise. How can, for example, the hydroelectricity in Norway being used for addressing, some of the renewables that are in Denmark, for example. It's thinking about what is the best from each country and how that collaborative, knowing that in Norway there's the Nordic Investment Bank, just as a case example, how do you build out more of that collective voice and also collective leadership?
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned universities. I think that perhaps, is that a blind spot at the moment in terms of the links with universities and finding talent and ideas that way? Does more need to be done to kind of help that thrive and build those links?
Yeah, so I'm sure that more needs to be done, but I'd also say that there's some really good examples that sort of make me very hopeful that sort of there's a really good practice that can continue on, right? Just coming here in Gothenburg is, it's a perfect example. But where I live in France, you also have now what was created, which is the battery school. So we have the equivalent of Northvolt called Vercors, and they work then with the French government and others to really create an education and a school for then what is the work that you need, what are the skills that you need in order to be part of that battery supply chain. In terms of what we're doing with the Fellows program, it's also a nominator program where we're working with the universities who have an expertise in certain areas and then helping them nominate who should apply to the Fellows program. So my sense is, that it takes the ecosystem, right? It's not one individual sort of player that's the weak link. But that said, there are sort of really good case examples. Why we're here. I also had the chance of visiting KTU in Stockholm, and sort of seeing some of these models where you're actually forming entrepreneurs, not only the best researchers, but also the entrepreneurs, and then making sure that the university has a team of facilitators who can then help, find the corporate partnerships, find the right type of funding that you need. So I'm certainly optimistic that there are some really good examples, and where a lot of my colleagues are in the US, there's some very good examples again of how the universities are doing it very well in the US as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely check out the battery school. That sounds fascinating. You've written before about the need to de-risk investments and kind of move capital from off the sidelines, and I think you used a phrase, shovels on the ground.
Yeah.
That's the sort of the point that we should be aiming for. What kinds of actions are needed to reach that shovels in the ground point?
Yeah. So this started by a speech by a politician that said, look at all of the projects that we have in hydrogen, look at all of the projects we have in sustainable aviation fuels in Europe, and look how great we are. But then if you look at sort of the actual figures, announced projects does not mean that those projects have reached final investment decisions. And so you're right, I did write about this in terms of there's a number of challenges for why you can't get those shovels in the ground, and they come from different perspectives. If you think about the number of the amounts of investments that we need in order to build those factories, in order to build those plants so they actually produce hydrogen, we're talking about $1 trillion. That's a bit what the IEA has been saying in terms of total amount. But then when you're talking to an investor, they'll be saying, well, the investment proposition isn't there yet because of a number of reasons, because you don't have bankable offtake, i.e. offtake that sort of lasts 10 years or more. Or your technology is too risky, so we need to think about how you're going to de-risk that. If you're an industrial, you'd probably want a performance guarantee. And the challenges go on. Or you have a site, but then you're not connected to the power grid yet in order to be able then to have your energy. So I think what we've tried to decouple is sort of explain the different issues, and then say from the investor perspective, it's not that you need to have all of these projects fully de-risked. The question is to be able to identify the risk. Is it a feedstock risk? Is it a technology risk? Is it going to be an offtake risk? And be able then to allocate that type of risk with the different players that are at the table who are willing to share that. So some of the things that we need to work on is making sure, indeed, that when a company is going to buy the hydrogen or when a company is going to buy the sustainable aviation fuel, it doesn't say, I'm going to buy it for 1 year or 2 years, and then we'll see, and expect then that the plant be built. So working on that sort of off-take agreement is very important. Then in terms of the type of capital that you need, it's making sure that you're able to get the type of sort of patient capital, the type of equity, and the type of debt that banks can provide. And that's the really hard part, right? And so that's certainly why we created the Catalyst program, where a dozen of organizations all committed to providing about $1 billion to this program that's going to be financing projects. And what they do is they identify projects that are either at a demonstration scale, so lower than 60 million, or at a first kind commercialization scale, and that's more in the realms of 100 million, and cater to the type of financing that is best for those. That means being able to provide equity, and that's what Catalyst provides if it's large scale, or providing what we call the Green Premium Grant to help. We know that some of these projects will be more expensive, and that's a term that we use quite a lot, which is the Green Premium. And we need to be able, in the absence of good public policy, being able to support that ourselves in the time for the Green Premium to go down. So the Catalyst program provides that, and we have a partnership with the European Commission and the European Investment Bank, where we've agreed for projects in Europe up to $1 billion of total investments, we're able to support these projects. And so the EIB provides its debt programs, venture debt programs, or its quasi-equity. And then we match that for when we give a grant for these large-scale programs, the European Commission also matches that.
Okay.
So what we saw in Dubai at the COP, what we announced was 2 projects, our first 2 European projects. One is for a long-duration energy battery storage technology in Sardinia, which is really important because they've got a lot of renewables, and so this is going to enable them to have more continuous power. And that was a grant from our side and venture debt from the European Commission. And then in Sweden, we funded the first e-methanol plant, so using renewable electricity, capturing biogenic CO2 and making that into a fuel that the shipping sector could use. And here we provided equity, and then we matched that grant from the European Commission. But I'd say the other important piece, which is one case that we can speak to in the US, is we financed with equity a sustainable aviation fuel plant. And what was really interesting in this story is that not only was there the money, and that's my colleagues in the Catalyst team saying it's not all about the money. What they helped do is they helped convince American Airlines and Citi to then have a 10-year offtake agreement. So all of a sudden the economics of these plants change because you've got a commitment around volume and time for these projects. So all of this to say is that it's very hard to get the shovels in the ground, but that's why we're all serious about getting there, because there's so much to be done.
Totally. I love hearing those examples. I think it really kind of brings home what is possible, but also, maybe the road bumps that others can learn from as well. Yeah. I guess, we've been speaking a lot about partnerships this, the last couple of days. I've heard some great advice around partnerships, and a panelist previously in the day said that partnerships are the new leadership. What are your thoughts on that, and how can better, more long-lasting partnerships be fostered in this space?
Yeah. So I think someone was saying you need to nurture your partnerships as well. So first of all, it's not a partnerships for one-off, but it's really thinking about how we can build up the ecosystem together. I'll give a case example of what we've done in the face of the war in Ukraine last year at the Munich Security Conference. We launched something called the Energy Resilience Leadership Group, which was all about how do we help through some of the best and brightest sort of startups and companies that we're seeing that are developing solutions that can help Europe get off from natural gas. How can we help them get to the forefront of partnerships with large corporates? So we set up with Breakthrough Energy and Siemens Energy this Energy Resilience Leadership Group. And everything is about how do we, in the next 24 months, scale the partnerships between the small and the big to help industrialize. But of course, it's not just about partnerships between a startup and a large corporate. It's also about partnerships with the banks. So we have financial institutions in this leadership group. And we also have the policymakers with the idea of we're showing what are the opportunities of partnerships, but also what are the challenges. I mentioned in terms of financing. I also another important thing is about regulation. And so there's there are many case examples out of this energy resilience leadership group, but one partnership is with a company called ESS that's developing an iron-flown battery that is then working with LEAG, which is a utility in Germany that is trying to decarbonize. It's mostly been a coal-based utility, and it's trying to become a green sort of powerhouse in the region. And so there was this matching between ESS that's providing energy storage with this utility that's keen to invest much more in renewables. So the ability then for that region and for that hub really to decarbonize, and that's only been, essentially the ERLG really helped accelerate that. And there are many more case examples of how we're seeing that these types of partnerships, again, it's not one company with another company, it's really the ecosystem of technology, of capital, of policy and partnerships that make up sort of the good cases. And it's hard, I mean, these things take time, but we've certainly been sort of working towards building that up even further.
Yeah, so I think the title of our talk is around the breakthroughs we need, and you've run through many breakthroughs that have happened, but I suppose if you were to name 3 breakthroughs that you really want the crowd to kind of come away with that you feel should be a priority, what would they be?
It's always the million-dollar question, right? But I can say that we've taken stock of where our journey has been at Breakthrough, and we launched a report called the State of the Transition Report. And in that, we talk about what are the 3 acceleration buttons. Those 3 acceleration buttons are electricity, and making sure that we have the power grids that we need, but equally making sure that we have, new types of base load. So how do we accelerate geothermal? How do we accelerate the types of storage solutions that we need? So first, I'd categorize really in terms of the electricity and electrification. Second, I'd say it's within the molecules, right? So how do we accelerate the production both of green hydrogen? We're starting to speak more about geologic hydrogen, which could certainly be a game changer in terms of costs. But then the use of that, right? It's one thing to have hydrogen, but you need to have off-takers. And the perfect example is H2 green steel. How do you decarbonize an industry without talking about hydrogen, but talking about clean steel?
Yeah.
So hydrogen, I'd say, is sort of another area. And then the third, which is also what we need to work on, is more around carbon management. How do we address the overflow of GHG emissions that we have, and how do we what are the options for us to either directly capture from the ambient air the GHG emissions and store it, or utilize them in a way then to avoid using more fossil-based fuels that will, emit CO2. So I'd say it's around those 3 areas. I get really excited about cement, so I'm certainly seeing a lot of breakthroughs in how you make new cement, how you can, make concrete, avoiding the need for cement. So, but that's a really hard one to crack. We're still very focused on it, especially from a public policy perspective. But that's certainly an area. So yeah, there's a lot of breakthroughs that we see. I mean, we're seeing not just through our portfolio companies, but all of the ecosystem that we have. There's so many interesting companies that certainly there's a lot to be excited about.
Yeah, I think, in terms of optimism, the headlines feel pretty gloomy. Today it was announced that January was the hottest month on record. And do you feel that working in this space, there's a lot to feel optimistic about? And how easy is that to stay optimistic?
I'm optimistic, and our whole organization is optimistic. And when you listen to Bill Gates, he always ends up with a word of optimism and how optimistic he is. I'm certainly very optimistic, but also realistic of the challenges ahead. And I think saying that everything is glorious and that we'll be able to solve the climate challenge problem without sort of rolling our sleeves and addressing the challenges, we're not going to get there. A lot of, in some countries where we're working, you still have, not that this is a bad thing, but you still have generalist VCs. We need to get more of that capital into the climate space. Similarly, we see a lot of infrastructure funds into this space, but when you talk about disruption and disruptive technologies for them, they go away, right? So it's about finding the right types of match, and how do you make efficient and best use of public funding, knowing that public purses are also very scarce.
Yeah.
And it's working with the best and building out the voice of optimism. I think I have little kids, and it tears me when they start talking about they don't want to take the car because it's going to pollute too much. I'd rather much say, well, let's buy an electric car and let's sort of still be able to go from one place to another. So this is where I think that there's a big role for innovation to solve, but we need to be serious around what are the challenges and how do we mobilize, be that, voters, so we make sure that we get the right, politicians in place. It's about companies that take the risk and be vocal about the solutions. It's about investors and being able to mobilize them. And it's about all of us that are here in the universities shaping the best and brightest minds for the future.
Yeah. Well, Julia, I think that's a really amazing note to end on, a really empowering note to end on. So I can't thank you enough for spending time with me today.
Thank
it's
you
been
so
brilliant.
much,
I've learned
Megan.
a lot. I hope all the audience has as well. And yeah, can we have a round of applause for
And
Julia?
for Megan, thank you so much.